Wow. It's a great honor to have been asked to give these remarks, and I won't delay. I'll just get right to it. A specter haunts the domestic political landscape in America today. It is the specter of racial conflict, growing out of the anger and alienation of too many Black Americans. The pundits tell us that we're living in a period of racial reckoning in America. Racial dispute suffuses our public life, from school committee elections to national political contests. This estrangement of intellectuals, politicians, journalists, and activists derives in turn from the fact of persisting Black disadvantage across so many fronts in our country's economic and social life. The reality here is too familiar, too widely known to require elaborate recitation. Whether talking about health or wealth, education or income, imprisonment or criminal victimization, the relatively disadvantaged status of those Americans who descend from slaves, here in the third decade of the 21st century, more than 150 years after the emancipation, is palpable. What are we to make of this? That question has bedeviled me for decades. Indeed, ever since I began graduate studies in economics at MIT a half-century ago. So it is with heavy heart that I stand before you this morning, a Black American economist in this era of racial discontent in my country, an Ivy League professor and a descendant of slaves, a beneficiary of a civil rights revolution now over 2 generations in the past, which made possible for me a life that my ancestors could only have dreamed of. But more than that, I am a patriot who loves his country. I am a man of the West, an inheritor of its great traditions. As such, I feel compelled to represent the interests of my people here and now. But that reference is not unambiguous, invoking, as it does, both communal and civic antecedents. So then, what are my responsibilities right here, right now? I declare for all the world to hear that no matter the political turmoil that may envelop us, and regardless of my racial or ethnic identification, my fundamental responsibility is to stay in touch with reality and to insist that others do as well. As the great Thomas Sowell once put it, given a choice between rhetoric and reality, we are best served to eschew the former and to embrace the latter. And that is what I am about this morning. That, I believe, is what this historic moment requires of all of us. The future of our democratic experiment is at stake. We Americans of all stripes have a great deal in common. Those commonalities can and should be the means of building bridges undergirded by patriotism between us Blacks and the nation as a whole. At bottom, we all want the same things: a legitimate shot at achieving the American dream, where each generation can do better than the one that came before. We all want to feel secure in our persons and our property. We all want clean and orderly communities with good services. We want a government that works for us and not the other way around. We want fair and equal treatment in the broader society and by our institutions. Connections between various groups in America could be stronger if we focus more on the things that we have in common instead of the things that divide us. And left to their own devices, that is what Americans of all races would be inclined to pursue. However, there are those among us who make a living by focusing on our differences, by claiming that there is something fundamentally wrong with America. These people are in error and their grave error threatens to tear us apart. They must be opposed forthrightly, and I intend to do so in these brief remarks. It is far too easy to overstate our problems and to understate what has been achieved. The right idea, I maintain, for Black Americans and for the country at large, is in the conduct of our public business to emphasize our common American interest and to de-emphasize our superficial racial differences. Now, racial disparities are real, of course, but inequality in America is not solely or even mainly a racial issue. There are many poor and marginalized white people. They deserve our concern too. The rate of interracial marriages has grown dramatically. An increasing number of people view themselves as multiracial, including the first Black president and vice president of this country. We talk constantly about racial identity and seldom about culture or values. Don't these things transcend race? So, how are we to understand the alienation afflicting so many prosperous Black Americans? I believe this is the result of the false narratives being promulgated by demagogues and ideologues. Narratives about how white supremacy threatens them, about how we have in effect reverted to the era of Jim Crow, about how the country allegedly has its metaphorical knee on our Black necks, about how racist cops are supposedly hunting us down in the streets such that it has become open season on Black people. Facts seem insufficient to stop these false narratives. My work seeks to rebut these departures from reality, in part just by looking at what has happened over the last 75 years. A Black middle class has emerged. There are Black billionaires. Our influence on American culture is stunning and has worldwide resonance. In fact, when viewed in global comparative perspective, we Black Americans are rich and powerful, with, for example, 10 times the per capita income of a typical Nigerian. The cultural barons and elites of America, the people who run the mainstream media, who give out literary prizes and foundation grants, who run the human resource departments of corporate America, the universities, and the movie studios, these powerful people have all signed on as allies with Blacks in our struggle for racial justice. They have bought into the woke racial sensibility hook, line, and sinker. All of this disproves the premise that the American dream does not apply to Black people. To say so is to tell our children a lie about their country. It is a crippling lie which, when taken as gospel, robs Black people of our agency and a sense of control over our fate. And it is a patronizing lie that betrays profound doubt about the ability of us Black Americans to face up to the responsibilities and to bear the burdens of our freedom. For this is the existential challenge we Black Americans now face in the 21st century, not to throw off the shackles of our supposed oppression, but rather to take up the burdens of our freedom. As such, it is time to clear the air and, in a spirit of love for my people, to tell some unpalatable truths. So brace yourselves. Here is my fundamental claim. Bearing the burdens of Black freedom in America today means accepting the fact that socially mediated behavioral issues lie at the root of today's racial inequality problem. These behavioral problems are real and must be faced squarely to grasp why racial disparities persist. These are American problems, not merely matters of communal concern to Black people. Nevertheless, downplaying these behavioral problems is a bluff. Activists on the left claim white supremacy, implicit bias, old-fashioned anti-Black racism are sufficient to account for Black disadvantage. While making such arguments, they are in effect daring you to disagree with them. You must be a racist, they say, one who thinks something is intrinsically wrong with Black people if you fail to attribute pathological behaviors to systemic injustice. You must think Blacks are inferior, for how else could one explain the disparities? Calling their bluff risks being convicted of the offense of blaming the victim. But this is a dare. It's a debater's trick. For instance, at the end of the day, what are those folks saying when they declare that mass incarceration is racism, that the high number of Blacks in prison is a self-evident sign of racial antipathy? Here's what they're saying. They are daring you to respond, no, it's mainly a sign of antisocial behavior by criminals who happen to be Black. To do so is to risk being dismissed as a moral reprobate. This is so even if the speaker is Black. Just ask Justice Thomas. Nobody wants to be canceled, but we should all want to stay in touch with reality. Overwhelming evidence suggests that those in prison are mainly those who have hurt someone, stolen something, or have otherwise violated the basic behavioral norms that make civil society possible. The violent criminals taking lives on the mean streets of St. Louis, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Chicago are, to a person, behaving despicably. Any ideology that ascribes this violent behavior to racism is simply not credible. But then, why have so many been getting away with espousing it for so long? Neither could any sensible person believe that 7 in 10 African American babies being born to a woman without a husband is either a good thing or is due to anti-Black racism. People may say this, but they don't believe it. They're bluffing. They are daring you to observe this reality, that the 21st century failures of so many African Americans to take advantage of the opportunities created by the 20th century's revolution of civil rights are palpable and damning. These failures are being denied at every turn, but that position is simply not tenable. The end of Jim Crow segregation and the advent of the era of equal rights were transformative events for our country. And now, a half century down the line, we still have significant disparities. This is a shameful blight on American society, I agree. But the fact of the matter, the reality, is that a considerable responsibility for this sorry state of affairs lies with Black people ourselves. Dare we Americans acknowledge this? Dare we Black Americans accept our share of responsibility for it? Why, the success of the civil rights movement notwithstanding, has the unequal status of Black Americans persisted into the 21st century? Clear thinking about this problem requires us to distinguish between the role played by anti-Black discrimination, past and present, and the role of behavioral patterns to be found among some Blacks. Now, I admit, this puts what is a very sensitive issue starkly. I acknowledge that anti-Black biases exist and should be remedied. But I am also urging that we Blacks identify and seek to reverse the patterns of behavior among us that prevent some of our people from seizing newly opened opportunities. In recent writing, I have cast these two positions as causal narratives. Under the bias narrative, one argues that the cause of persisting disparity is anti-Black racism and that we must continue to reform American society toward achieving a level playing field. The focus there is on the demand side of the labor market. I hold that such reform, now well advanced, is necessary but not sufficient. By contrast, what I call the development narrative, emphasizes the need to consider how people acquire the skills, traits, habits, and orientations that foster their successful participation in society. Here, the focus is on the supply side of the labor market. Youngsters without the experiences, who are not exposed to the influences, and who lack access to the resources that foster and facilitate their human development, will fail to achieve their full potential. Now, these two narratives are not mutually exclusive, but in terms of prescribing intervention and remedy, they point in very different directions. This tension between a focus on demand side and supply side factors in accounting for persistent racial disparities is a very old theme for me, dating back to my doctoral thesis at MIT, where I contrasted the concept social capital with the more familiar economic idea of human capital. My fundamental point was to distinguish the logic of economic transactions from the logic of human relations, especially when trying to explain persistent racial disparity. Business investments are transactional, but human investments are essentially relational. As I saw it, the conventional economic theory was incomplete when it comes to explaining racial disparities, and there were two aspects of this incompleteness, one having to do with human development and the other with racial identity. My first observation was that all human development is socially situated and mediated. That is, the development of human beings occurs inside of social institutions. It takes place as between people, by way of human interaction, the family, school, peer group. These cultural institutions of human association are where development is achieved. Resources essential to human development, the attention that a parent gives to her child, for instance, are not alienable. Most developmental resources are not commodities. The development of human beings is not up for sale. Rather, structured connections between individuals create the context within which developmental resources come to be allocated to individual persons. Opportunity travels along the synapses of these social networks. Because people are not machines, their productivity, which is to say the behavioral and cognitive capacities that bear on their social and economic functioning, is not merely the consequence of a mechanical infusion of material resources. Rather, these capacities are also the byproducts of social processes mediated by networks of human affiliation and connectivity. This was fundamentally important, I thought, and still think, for understanding persistent racial disparities in America. That was the first point I wanted to make all those years ago about the incompleteness of human capital theory. My second observation was that what we call race in America is mainly a social and only indirectly a biological phenomenon. Persisting racial differentiation across generations between large groups of people in an open society where people live cheek by jowl is irrefutable indirect evidence of a profound separation between the racially defined networks of social affiliation within that society. Over time, race would cease to exist unless people chose to act in a manner so as biologically to reproduce the variety of phenotypic expression that constitutes the substance of racial distinction. I cannot overemphasize this point. We speak casually about racial equality and racial justice, and yet race is not simply given in nature, it is socially produced. It's an equilibrium outcome. It's something we're making. It is endogenous. It follows that if one is to understand the roots of durable racial inequalities in any society, then one will need to attend in some detail to the processes that cause race to persist as a fact in that society, because almost certainly such processes will not be unrelated to the allocation of human developmental resources in that society. I conclude from these two observations that economists should recognize the limits of our tools to explain persistent disparities by race, because the creation and reproduction of racial inequality ultimately rest on cultural conceptions about identity that people embrace, blacks and whites alike. These are the convictions that people affirm about the legitimacy of conducting intimate social relations with racially distinct others, and here I do not only mean sexual relations. Racial inequality is inescapably a cultural phenomenon, I maintain, implicating not only the transfer of resources, but more fundamentally, the decisions we make daily about with whom to associate and to identify. My contrast between human and social capital reflects my conviction that beliefs of this kind ultimately determine the access that people enjoy to the informal and non-fungible resources needed to develop their human potential. What I called social capital, when I coined that term in 1976, is, on this view, a critical prerequisite for the production of human capital. And as we economists know all too well, this human capital, that is the skills, the education, the work experience, and social aptitudes individuals possess, determines a person's earnings and his or her capacity to generate and to accumulate wealth. The narrative that we Black Americans settle upon, emphasizing bias or development, looking to their politics or to our culture, seeking to combat anti-Black racism or striving to rebuild the Black family, embracing victimization or accepting responsibility, this choice is crucial. What is more, this choice of narratives governs how we Black Americans view our place within this great republic, the United States of America. This is worth arguing about. Is this a good country? One affording boundless opportunity to all who are fortunate enough to enjoy the privileges and to bear the responsibilities of citizenship? Or, as some latter-day revisionists would have it, is this a venal, rapacious, bandit society full of plundering racists, founded in genocide and slavery, propelled by capitalist greed and unrepentant anti-Black antipathy? I regret to report that this latter narrative is being taught to young people in our schools and universities across the land, and yet the weight of the evidence overwhelmingly favors the former, in my view. The founding of the United States of America in 1776, 1787 was a world historic event by means of which Enlightenment-era ideals about the rights and dignity of persons and the legitimacy of state power became instantiated in real institutions. True enough, the founding entailed a compromise with slavery, and yet now, some 40 million strong, we Black Americans have become by far the richest and most powerful large population of African descent on this planet. The question then is this: are we Blacks going to look through the dark lens of the United States as a racist, genocidal, white supremacist, illegitimate force? Or are we going to come to see our nation for what it has in fact become over the course of these last 3 centuries, which is the greatest force for human liberty in the history of the world? I wish fervently to argue the latter course. For, as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. well understood, that is the surest pathway for us to gain economic and political equality. The Civil War left 600,000 dead in a country of 30 million. The consequence of that war, together with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, enacted just afterwards, was to make the enslaved Africans and their descendants into citizens. And in the fullness of time, we have become equal citizens of this great republic. That should not have taken another 100 years, nor should my ancestors have been enslaved in the first place. But here's the thing. Slavery was a commonplace human practice dating to antiquity. Emancipation, the freeing of 4 million enslaved persons as a result of a mass movement for abolition, that was a new idea, a Western idea, an American idea. It was the fruit of Enlightenment philosophy and Christian charity. It was an idea brought to fruition over a century and a half ago in our own United States of America with the liberation of an enslaved people. Such an achievement would not have been possible without philosophical insights and moral commitments that had been cultivated in the 17th and 18th centuries in the West. Ideas about the essential dignity and the God-given rights of all human persons. That is, America's founding at the end of the 18th century brought into the world something new. Slavery was a Holocaust, out of which emerged an accomplishment that advanced the morality and the dignity of humankind, namely emancipation. The ultimate incorporation of we African-descended people fully into the American body politic has been a monumental and unprecedented achievement for human freedom. To whom much has been given, of him much shall be required. Allow me to conclude. Freedom is one thing, equality quite another. The former is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the latter. Here then is my final truth. It is both futile and dangerous for us Black Americans to rely on others to shoulder our communal responsibilities. If we want to walk with dignity, to enjoy equal standing within this diverse, prosperous, and dynamic society, then we must accept the fact that white America can never give us what we seek in response to our protests and remonstrations. Rather, we must earn equal status by dint of our own efforts. I take no pleasure in doing so, but I feel obliged to report this reality: equality of dignity, equality of standing, of honor, of security in one's position, and equal ability to command the respect of others. Such things cannot be handed over. They will not be the fruit of insurrection or violent uprising or rebellion. Equality of this sort, the only sort worth having, is something we must wrest with our bare hands from a cruel and indifferent world by means of our own effort, inspired by the example of our enslaved and newly freed ancestors. We must make ourselves equal. No one can do that for us. My fear is that until we Americans recognize and accept this inexorable fact about the human condition, until we eschew the rhetoric and embrace the reality about race in our country, the disparities that have so troubled our politics and that so threaten our domestic tranquility will continue to persist. Thank you.